Thank you all for joining. I know this is the last session of the day, just before the drinks. I was prepared to talk to myself, so I'm glad to see that some of you showed up to show support, so appreciate it. Let's get started. My name is Ashish Jain. I am a Chief Product Officer for a company called Arkose Labs, and we do bot management, fraud detection, and account security. Prior to joining Arkose, I used to run identity, risk, trust, and fraud for eBay. And that included all registration, authentication, KYC, AML, cancellation, disputes, and a variety of other things. I have been in the identity space for almost 2 decades now. I was heavily involved in the early days of SAML. I used to work for Ping. So it's interesting to see that when I hear about SAML being retired, given the fact that I was there in 2005 when we first started it. I also sit on the board of OpenID Foundation. And the most of the work that we spend around in the identity community is around how do we make access enable for good users. And a few years ago, I ended up spending a little bit more time in the risk and the fraud industry, and that eventually ended up making me join Arkose. And the message that I want to kind of bring to the table today is that how identity and fraud are very, very interlinked. And sometimes we think in isolation, sometimes we build in isolation, and there is some convergence in between these two work streams that I'm hoping we get to kind of build together. Okay? So the topic for today, I want to talk about a little bit identity and fraud. I want to give you a sneak preview of how does the fraudsters operate. So on the way back home when you're flying, if you are feeling lucky and you want to attack a few websites, I want to give you a few tools. And then we talk about MFA. If you have been here for the last 3 days, I'm sure you have heard plenty of times why passwords are bad, why we should deploy MFA, things about FIDO and WebAuthn and then passkeys. And all that is great, and I fully support why we should go. But I want to talk about a little bit why that may not be enough when it comes down to rolling it out to your consumers. And then I have a few recommendations that I would like to share. Now, coming back to how I think these two things are connected, when you talk to the identity team and every protocol that you hear, whether it is around SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect, whether it is around verifiable credentials, whether it is about passkeys, most of the time the focus is how do I enable access for a good user? How do you get to prove that who you are with as less friction as possible? And at that time, the metrics that we deploy, and most of my talk, by the way, is based on my experience at eBay and working with customers at Arkose, focused on the consumer side of the identity. So if you are looking into the enterprise workflow identity, it may still be relevant, but the examples I'm going to use are more tainted towards consumer, right? So the metrics that the identity teams are responsible for is, for instance, the number of registrations, like how many new registrations that you get per day, how many people go to the forget your password page, how many people attempt it, how many people are successful, how many people come to the login page, how many of you attempt it, how many of you are able to complete. So everything that we do in the identity world to lower the friction and to increase the growth numbers. The fraud side, on the other side, if you talk to your risk and fraud team, their focus has always been how many ATOs do I see, how many chargebacks do I see, how many refunds and cancellations do I see, and how do I measure that? So the balance in between the two is very, very critical, and sometimes we don't completely get it right. An example of that would be that if you make a new account registration at a website, and if I ask you to verify your email address, then ballpark, the percentage dropout rate I'm going to get is about 15 to 20%. So every time you go to a website, you want to create a new account, and if I ask you, go back, click on the link in your email, this is how much dropout I get. And that is impactful for the identity side because the moment I do it, my growth numbers doesn't look as good. Similarly, I can have the password length go from 8 to 12 characters, and that you get about 20% dropout rate. And we discuss it all the time, and we've done a bunch of A/B testing that should I go for 8 characters, definitely less friction, or should I go for 12 characters? And the decision impacts not only what is the completion successful rate for sign-in, it also impacts that you are potentially now lowering the defenses for the bad users. The other example that I have is that around refunds and cancellation. In a retail industry, generally overall, Walmart and Costco and eBay of the world, you get about 8% return rate. So the number of people who end up buying an item and return is about 8%. Now, if your company or your retail site that you're operating, if your return and cancellation is about 4%, what does that mean? Does that mean your policies are great and you're able to detect repeat offenders from buying the same t-shirt and returning 5 times? Or does that mean that your return and cancellation experience is too complex and people are just giving up? And we call them silent sufferers, which is, it's not worth my time to go try to figure out how to talk to a customer rep and return it, so I just going to abandon it. And the balance in between the friction and lowering that for a good user and the defenses that you're lowering implicitly for the bad users is essentially what I would like to spend a little bit more time and focus. And you may make the argument, why this important? Why should we talk about fraud a little bit more in the identity-centric world? This is a bunch of the stats for you to kind of understand it a little bit. If you are operating a website or if you go to a website, 1 in 5 login attempt to your website is actually an account takeover attempt. Just think about it that 20% of the people who are logging into your website are trying to take over the account of a genuine user. And in the last year, we saw 85% new registration increase. And this is when people make fake accounts and they can find different ways to be able to monetize it. And overall, if you talk in the industry, the bot traffic, which is the amount of people, kind of a junk traffic coming to your site, which takes compute, takes resources, impacts your site speed, that average number is about 35 to 40% in the industry ballpark without any vertical. And if you go into the peak time, for instance, the retailers at the time of Christmas or Thanksgiving, that traffic rate goes to about 75%. This is 75% of traffic coming to your website, taking your resources, impacting your site speed, and impacting compute. This is the amount of traffic that you see every day. Overall, in 2023, the online fraud industry is about $43 billion. So this is the amount of traffic. $43 billion is what we are dealing with. You may make the argument, why is that so much easy? There are 3 factors which kind of comes into it. A, there is a shadow ecosystem. Let me ask you this question. How many of you have ever robbed a bank? Okay, let's chat afterwards. How many of you have seen a movie where you have seen being robbing a bank? There you go. And in 2022, you don't walk into a bank with a mask on and with a gun and with the bags and then go to the cashier and say, give me the money. What you do is that you walk in and you do an online fraudulent attack and you try to take the money. Similar to how you may have seen in the movies, there are 3 parts of how you go attack a bank. There is how do you get the data? This goes back to where the cameras, where the security guards. The second one is when you actually run the attack. And the third one is how do you move the money? And in the shadow ecosystem on the dark web, there are established entities and parties which are responsible for each of those 3 independent efforts. So they are established money mules. All they do is that once the money has been secured, how do I get the money out? Whether I do that through Bitcoin, I do that through gift card. If you're a Breaking Bad fan, how do I open a car wash? There are multiple ways to be able to move the money out. And then you have a set of people, their complete job is to be able to get the data. So every time when you see a breach coming in, whether it's Target or Verizon or Capital One, the next day you will have a set of people and their complete job is just to get that list of a username and a password and sell, and then that's it. This is how organized the ecosystem is. The second part is the barrier to entry, and I'm going to show you some tools of why the barrier to entry to take that list and make an attempt is so easy. And the third part, and I'll share some stats on what we have seen, which is the cost and the economics benefit of a fraudsters to attack it. I'm not going to go into detail into all of them. I'll just touch upon them a little bit. But if you think about, I'm sure this audience has heard about phishing and vishing and credential stuffing and all that. One thing which we have recently seen a little bit more that I want to touch upon is that, I'm sure we talked about SIM swapping in the context of MFA and why SMS sometimes has a loophole. The other thing that we have recently seen a lot more are automated bots which can actually help you with social engineering of SIM swapping. If you think about it, most of the time it happens a lot more in India and a few other countries of if you have 2FA enabled, the second factor is SMS, if the fraudster have access to your username and a password, they're going to go to the site and then they're going to call you by saying, hey, I'm going to send you a token. I'm talking from the bank. Can you please repeat that to me? And I'm going to check something on your account. And a bunch of people fall for that. Now there's a bots available. It's called SMS Ranger if you go do a Google search, which claims about 80% efficacy where people will fall for it. It's the same attack, but in the past, somebody has to spend their time, make you a phone call, 5% success rate. Now I can completely scale it by running it through a bot. So this is the kind of the world that we live in. And talk a little bit more about the tools that we get to use. So this is something called SentryMBA. This is an open source tool. If you go search for it, you will find it. And not the best UI, but you can point it to the URL that you want to go, so Netflix or eBay or Walmart, and it will figure out what is the right login API endpoint. It will figure out what is the right username and a password format that the website is expecting. And what you do is then you give it a bunch of lists, a username and a password. These are called combo lists. And like I said, anytime you see a breach, the next day in the dark web, you can go and buy the username and a password combo list. And if you do not have access to that, I want to try it out, just go to Pastebin, search for combo list. You will see a variety of combinations already available for you to cut paste. Take that information, do a paste into this tool, keep it running for a while. In an hour or two, without any effort from you, it's going to come back and then tell you that of the 1 million accounts that you copied and pasted it, 100 of them were successful, and now you have a valid username and a password combination. And if you are wondering, man, this may be a little bit too much, I don't know how I come to speed of that, there's something called YouTube. The same place where you go to learn NFT and Web3, which is a little bit harder to understand. This is actually much easier because there are a bunch of tutorials which will tell you exactly how to get started. It will tell you where to get the username and a password list. It will tell you where to rent the compute resources for cheaper, and you get to try this out. Okay, completely open source, there's a community behind it, free for you to try out on your way back home. Once you get a little bit more excited, and like this seems like I can probably make more money, and then you're thinking that, look, my laptop, company issued laptop, limited bandwidth, compute is a challenge. You can actually go there and you can buy compute by the hour. You can buy a bunch of dedicated servers because then you can run multiple SentryMBA in parallel. As you can imagine, the moment the list gets out in public, you want to try that as quickly as possible so that your success rate is a little bit higher. So you can borrow them by the hour. One of the common things, most of the websites in the consumer space have some kind of a velocity checks for IPs because, hey, look, I'm seeing so much traffic coming in. Guess what? You get to buy proxy IPs so that when you run the script, you can distribute your coming from a different IPs. In addition to that, you can also buy what you call credential IPs. They're a little bit more expensive, but they also have a higher reputation. So many times, companies like as eBay, we will have a list, what we call a block list. We know this is a data center, and why does so much traffic come from it? You can actually get these IPs for proxy pretty cheap, and you get to play around and bypass the defenses. Sometimes you will wonder that, man, why wouldn't I see a bunch of these Captchas coming all over the place, and they should be able to detect it. Well, I got news for you. There are Captcha solver services, and they publish their rates. The gig economy is not just about Uber and DoorDash. The gig economy is that they hire people in the fraud firm where you have low wages, where you solve 1,000 Captchas for $1, and these services will allow you at runtime to transfer the control when you see a Captcha so that somebody else can solve it. And like I said, you can buy them on a monthly basis, you can buy them on a total amount of Captchas you want to solve, and all of that is public knowledge. If you search for them, you can see their published rates and how to get access. If this was not enough, there's a new tool which comes up, it's called OpenBullet. And look, we used to have a policy at eBay that if you try your password 3 times in a row, then I'm going to block you for 15 minutes. And many of the websites have different types of policies to be able to deter these kind of activities. Well, these guys realized they need to collaborate. So they started to figure out how the policies of each website operate. Now they create blueprint and configuration profiles that you get to share with other friendly fraudsters. So not only then you can point to a website, you actually get templates, and you can search for eBay and Netflix and Walmart of how do I get pre-configured templates so that I know the policies and I know how to bypass them because it is pre-configured. So this is how easy they are trying to make it. There's no lack of innovation, as you can see. I talked about the UI for the first two wasn't as good. There's this new marketplace. It comes about 2 years ago in the market. It's called Genesis Marketplace. You can search for it. If you remember, if you try to log into Google from a brand new device, it's going to tell you that, hey, this is a new device I haven't seen before. I need an extra check. If you go to Netflix, they will let you log in, but they will send you an email by saying, hey, I detected a new activity from a new device. eBay did the same thing. We did not ask for additional verification. We let you log in, but we send you an email. Because what happens is many times, in addition to username and a password, most websites also keep a copy and information about the devices and device fingerprint, and they bind that. What Genesis Marketplace does is that instead of selling you just a combo list of username and a password, how about I give you a complete package? So they are a botnet, they deploy on your laptops, and they are able to collect your cookies, they steal them, they're able to get your device data, your user agent, and your OS information, and they do the mapping for you, and then they sell the whole thing as a package. So that and then they have a browser of their own, so that you can take the information and you can run it, and you get to bypass the flow that I just described that Google and eBay and Netflix does. And they are pretty advanced, so you can come in and you can search that, look, I'm looking for this website to attack. You can say I'm looking for credit card numbers only, and then you get to pay depending upon your price range. And this is the only one, by the way, which is an invite only. Everything I showed you before this is open source communities, download it, give it a try. Once you earn a little bit more of a street cred, there are a bunch of Telegram communities you can go and get an invitation to join this one. And when you talk to the fraudster, you say, look, what does that mean? How much do I make? This is some of the data and stats that we get that, once you buy a list about $550, I get to get a proxy service about $350. And the reward is that, depending on the vertical, like I get about $1 to $5 for per new account, 1,000 new accounts. And depending upon the compromised account, for instance, if you have a stolen credit card attached to an account, so if you go to eBay or Walmart, not every account has an attached Remember Me credit card. And if it is attached, it makes it easier. If the website supports shipping, it's a little bit more tricky. If it is virtual, like gift card, it is much more easier for me to get money out, but you can get up to $3,000. The bottom line is that if I do this, get a list in 1 day will fund my operation for a month. Okay, I'm going to pause here a little bit, have you digest it a little bit, and this is why when I made the comment that very complex established system, low barrier to entry, high rewards, 43 billion online fraud is what all this amounts to. This is the world we live in. Now, I'm going to turn switch because I hope I scared you a little bit. The drinks will taste so much more better this evening. Once you know that your information is so safe and protected out there. If you spend the last 2 days, across in this conference, you hear a million times that passwords are bad, we shouldn't use it, and we should move to MFA, and why this is a great idea. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. I also do not disagree with that we should exercise every single day, hasn't happened yet. I also agree with my dentist I should floss every day, still hasn't happened yet. And I feel like the passwords are not very different from that. It makes complete sense for us to be able to adopt it. That's not where we are as an industry. As part of my role at eBay, my team, we implemented all of those. We either rebuilt them from scratch or we did a major rehaul of all of those authentication methods. Each of those authentication methods have their pros and cons. Like for instance, I talked about if you use SMS, great idea. In addition to the bot attacks I mentioned to you, it's also cost a lot. Within US, it's about penny for one SMS. In China, it's about 5 cents. So it adds to the cost if you're doing SMS for everyone. You can do email verification where you always have a context switch, especially on your phone. You lose about 20% audience. You can use push notification on a phone, but then you're asking your users to download an app. So you get about 40% dropout right there. WebAuthn is great, but you do not have support for all the scenarios, all the applications and platform, and there was no account recovery at the time when we launched it, so it was a bit of a trickiness for us how to do it. All of those are great ideas, and we should implement it. My point is the adoption rate, I can't share the numbers I had for eBay, but generally if you find it, most consumer websites today is less than 5% of the adoption rate for the 2FA. And Twitter published it, 2.7% of the adoption rate, 75% was just SMS. And I do not expect that number to cross 2 digits in the next 1 year, in spite of as excited as I am to hear about what passkeys bring to the table. And 2 to 3 years from now, I still think that number would be less than 20%. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up the second part of the presentation. Where does that leave us? This concept called as passive authentication. I don't know if this is an industry term. I use it. So I define active authentication as when you require an end user to be able to interact. So username and password, SMS, email, and all that. And I require passive authentication where I can get a little bit better information about you without having any interaction from you. So anytime a user comes to your website, I get to know your IP. So I know you're coming from a VPN or not. I know you're coming from a proxy or not. You're coming from a Tor node or not. You're coming from a high abuse velocity. So I get a bunch of information about you without any interaction from you. Same thing goes for email. When I receive your email, I know you're coming from a burner domain. Email tumbling is when you can use Google alias or +1+2. This is how you get free Bed Bath & Beyond coupons every time you want to buy something. And you can, so everybody allows it. Same thing goes for phone. I can figure out this is a voice over IP number. I can see how, when it was activated, I have all of that data available to me every time a user comes to my website. In addition to that, since you're coming from a device, I can collect a bunch of information. So I know what an attack signature looks like. Because of the randomization, many fraudsters, the tools I showed you, try to spoof much of your signatures to create new signatures to bypass velocity. I get to be able to detect it. And same thing, the experiment we did was around behavior biometrics. We had a Captcha challenge, and the moment you solve it, I can detect whether or not you are a bot, completely automated, with this no mouse movement, no gesture, or if you're a human fraud because you know exactly how to solve it, or you're a real user because I know how much time a real user who is seeing the Captcha the first time will take to solve it. All of that data is available to me. And then we kind of combine them together into what we call the multi-detection approach. And if you look into the x-axis, this is the common attack patterns. Y-axis is just the IP spoofing. The z-axis is where I can take the information around spoofing. And if I triangulate those signals, I'm able to correlate without any user interaction and have a little bit better idea whether the person on the other side of the website is a real person, is a human fraud, or is that a bot? We did that at eBay, and we're also building that at Arkose, where I can take a bunch of attributes. So username, email address, credit card number, shipping address, and I get to create an identity graph. So then every time you come, I can create a reputation for each of those nodes, and I have a better idea whether or not you are real. Right? So for instance, if I have a credit card attached to 3 email addresses, attached to 5 devices, and if I know one email address is a bad user, I can now tag that credit card as something I should be flagging before I allow a checkout. So there are a bunch of things that you can do, and you can also create the same kind of a graph for a botnet to be able to detect fraudulent activity. Where it goes back to, you have 2 options. Like when you think about it, if you do not have these defenses, you either let the high risk traffic go through. In this case, they're going to damage your brand, going to reduce trust in the system, or you're going to end up blocking the end user because then you are not sure, and then you're going to reduce growth, right? And I think this is something that we have to all kind of deal with it and figure out what is the right balance. And I have tons of other examples that I can share with you afterwards of how do you make the choice, right? If I reduce my registration rate, if I get 1,000 people registration, and I know that about 2 to 5% of the people who make an account end up buying something, and I know 1% of that will, let's say, $20 an average purchase. So I know exactly that if I reduce my registration rate from 1,000 per day to 800, how much impact I'm going to have on my business. So every time I take a decision, when I say I'm going to ask you to do MFA, I have to keep that into account. Now, if I'm Fidelity, I'm holding your 401k account, I can enforce you, mandate you, that you have to do MFA. If I'm eBay, who's selling toasters and jeans for $29.99, there are plenty of other places you can go buy it. So I have to be very, very careful before I can mandate you that all of you have to implement MFA and you have to adopt MFA. So I have to kind of keep that into account before I make the call. Overall, my point is, in this conference and in this identity community, we talk a lot about identity protocols, identity experience, and usability. And there's the other side of identity, anonymous identity, device and IPs and behavior, which we also need to take into account. because the barrier to entry for fraudster is very, very low, and we should be taking that into account. Recommendations. My first one is to get started now. You hear a lot that, look, there's a silver bullet coming. I can tell you, doing that for 20 years, there is no silver bullet. You have to get started. You have to get started today. And I fully agree that you should implement MFA. In fact, you should implement more than one, because there is no silver bullet. There is no single MFA. The moment we get all excited at WebAuthn, then you realize, oh, wait a minute, there is challenges around this. What happens? Very quick example, we had 22 top-level domains at eBay. So every time you register an MFA WebAuthn, every user for eBay US and eBay Germany had to do it twice. And now if they have 3 devices, and now they share the device with their wife, and now they go to a public, there's just so many nuances when you are talking about 180 million users, diversity of the people, and you're talking your grandma in a garage, and you have to explain her what is a biometric device, biometric authentication. So we have to take into account. Having said that, we should all implement MFA. We should implement more than one. And then the other part is there's a bunch of passive signals, whether you use them yourself or use a vendor. They are available to you around IP, around devices, around user behavior. They can help augment to increase the defenses for the bad actors, and they can help you improve the friction or reduce the friction for a good user. I think that's all the time I have. Thank you for joining.